The wind in November 1843 did not just blow, it scoured. High in the Rockies, near the headwaters of the Arkansas River, the air was so thin and cold it seemed to steal the breath from a man's lungs before he could even draw it. The sound was a high, thin keen that never stopped, a blade being sharpened against the granite peaks. Below, in a small, sheltered valley, Jedediah Stone swung his axe again, the impact a dull thock against a frozen lodgepole pine. The sound was immediately ripped away by the gale. He paused, leaning on the handle, his beard a solid mass of ice. He was a man of 30, but the mountains had already carved him into something older, his eyes holding the flat, weary gaze of someone who perpetually calculated survival. He was checking his cash, and he already knew by the stillness, by the absence of jays and magpies, that something was terribly wrong. He'd left his heavy adze, its broad blade meticulously sharpened, leaning against a nearby aspen. It was a tool for shaping, for building, but it was useless for what came next. He walked the last 50 yards, his snowshoes sinking slightly, and stood at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a cache anymore, it was a violation. The heavy logs he'd laid over the top were scattered like kindling. The deep layer of stones, each heavier than a grown man, had been tossed aside, and in the middle was a deep, greasy pit, the snow around it trampled and stained, a grizzly. Not just any bear, but the old, scarred male he'd seen that summer, a creature that moved with the arrogant power of a monarch. Jedediah knelt. The air smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and the sickening, rancid sweetness of spoiled meat. He saw what was left, a few strips of torn hide, a greenish-black smear of what had been smoked venison, the crushed remains of the tins that held his salt and coffee. Everything. Months of hunting, weeks of smoking, curing, and packing, his entire winter gone. He felt a cold deeper than the wind, a hollowness in his gut that was pure, primal fear. It wasn't just hunger. It was the realization that the way he had been taught to do this, the standard way, was a fatal lie. This shallow pit covered in logs and stone wasn't a fortress, it was a dinner bell. He looked at the wreckage, the bear's massive, clawed tracks leading off into the timber. He had spent his summer building a pantry for the wilderness, and now the wilderness had claimed it. He picked up a torn piece of canvas, remembering the day he'd packed it, the satisfaction he'd felt. Now that satisfaction felt like the worst kind of foolishness. He had trusted in weight and logs, and the bear had trusted in leverage and hunger. The bear had been right. That winter would be the hardest of his life, a desperate scramble of trapping rabbits and digging roots, a constant gnawing hunger that pared him down to sinew and nerve. But as he starved, he thought about the cold, the earth, the frost, and the relentless, patient strength of the bear. He realized the problem wasn't the bear. The problem was the design. He had built that first cache just as he'd been taught by the men at the rendezvous, the seasoned trappers who had come before him. "Dig it shallow, Stone," one had told him, a man named Hobbs. "Just below the surface frost. The cold will do the work." So he had. In the late summer he'd chosen a spot on flat ground, well drained, and dug a pit perhaps 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and only 3 feet deep. He lined it with a thick bed of spruce boughs, a fragrant, springy mattress meant to keep the meat off the bare earth. He had worked for days hunting and preparing the meat, smoking strips of elk until they were dark and leathery, salting rounds of bison hump and packing dried berries in small deer-hide sacks. He laid it all in the pit, layering it with more boughs, a precious dusting of salt and a canvas tarp. He had felt proud of the work. It looked neat, efficient. Then he had laid the roof, a solid layer of thick aspen logs, side by side, followed by another layer laid perpendicular. On top of that, he had piled the stones he'd levered out of the creek bed, heavy, flat granite rocks that took 2 men to lift, but he had done it alone, using a pole as a lever, his muscles screaming. It had taken him a week to finish. It looked impenetrable. He had even, as a final touch, brushed away his tracks. It was a perfect, standard mountain man cache, and it had failed in less than a month. The first failure wasn't the bear. It was subtler. It was the damp. When he'd come back in October for his first withdrawal, a faint, sour smell had risen from the pit. The boughs were compressed and damp. A fine, pale mold was creeping onto the edges of the venison. The ground, still warm from summer, was breathing moisture into his supplies. He repacked it, cursed, and added more stones. The next intruder was a wolverine, a creature of astonishing, diabolical strength. It hadn't moved the rocks, but it had burrowed under them, squeezing between the logs, and had ruined a quarter of his supplies, not by eating them, but by spraying them with its foul, musky scent, rendering them inedible. He had rebuilt it again, angrily, chinking the logs with mud and pebbles, adding even heavier stones until he was exhausted. He had made it stronger, and in doing so, he had simply issued a greater challenge. The grizzly, drawn by the faint, lingering sense, had not bothered to burrow. It had simply dismantled his creation. The bear understood physics in a way Jedediah had not. It hadn't tried to lift the stones. It had rolled them, using its immense weight to tip them off the log pile. Once the stones were gone, the logs were a puzzle a child could solve. The loss was absolute. As he huddled in his cabin during the long snows of that winter, gnawing on stringy rabbit meat, he stared at his adze, the tool of creation. He had used it to shape the logs for his cabin, to smooth the planks for his table. It was a tool of precision, but his cache had been built with brute force, not precision. It was an idea based on ignorance. He had tried to build a barrier against the wilderness. He realized now he had to build with it. He had to use the one thing the bear couldn't move, the one thing the frost couldn't penetrate, the one thing the wolverine couldn't burrow through, the mountain itself. That spring, Jedediah Stone emerged from his cabin a leaner, harder man. He traveled to the summer rendezvous on the Green River, but he wasn't there just to trade his few paltry pelts. He was there to listen, to watch. He was done with the common wisdom of men like Hobbes. He sought out the quieter men, the ones who had been in the mountains for decades, and the indigenous people who moved through the landscape with an ease he envied. He watched a Ute family group from a respectful distance. He saw them prepare a storage pit, but it was nothing like his. It was a narrow, deep hole dug into the side of a shady cut bank, lined not with pine boughs, but with cured willow bark and dry grasses. They placed tubers and dried meat inside, and the opening was small, barely a foot across, sealed with a single perfectly fitted flat stone, and then covered with earth so completely it vanished. It was deep, it was narrow, and it was invisible. Later he sat with a French-Canadian trapper, Etienne Dubois, a man who had worked for the Hudson's Bay Company far to the north, in lands where the ground, he said, was frozen 300 feet deep, even in summer. Etienne smoked his pipe, the sweet smell of tobacco a rare luxury. "Your problem, mon ami," Etienne said, his voice a low rumble, is that you fight the earth, you build on it. The bear, the frost, they live on it too, so you are in their world. Jedediah listened, silent. In the north, Etienne continued, we learn from the Pergelisol. The frost, she is a beast, but below her, below the reach of the sun and the winter, the earth is quiet. It has one temperature. Always. He tapped his pipe on the stone hearth. In my grandfather's land in Quebec, they build the garde-manger. It is a house of stone, but it is built into the hill on the north side. The stone holds the cold. The earth, she wraps it like a blanket. The food inside, it does not freeze in winter. It does not rot in summer. It is at peace. Jedediah felt a charge run through him, the connection of two disparate ideas. The depth and invisibility of the Ute pit, and the thermal stability and permanence of Etienne's stone garde-manger. The ground wasn't just a place to hide things, it was a thermal engine. If you dug deep enough past the frost line, past the summer's heat, the earth itself would become the preservative. It would maintain a constant cool temperature, a perfect cellar, warmer than the lethal sub-zero air of January, but far cooler than the rotting heat of August. And the entrance. It couldn't be a pile of logs. It had to be a door, a single massive piece of the mountain itself. He no longer saw the bear as his enemy. He saw it as his teacher. The bear had taught him that anything that can be dismantled will be. Therefore, he had to build something that could not be dismantled. He had to build a hole in the mountain and seal it with a stone. He returned to his valley in late summer, but he did not begin hunting. The stores could wait. The vault came first. For a week he did nothing but walk his territory, his adze in hand, not as a tool, but as a counterweight, a focus for his thoughts. He wasn't looking for game trails or timber. He was reading the land, searching for the perfect convergence of geology and topography. He found it on a steep, north-facing slope, buried in a thick stand of old-growth aspen and fir. The north face was critical. It received almost no direct sunlight, meaning the ground temperature would be far more stable. The snows would lie deeper and melt later, adding to the insulation. And halfway up the slope, a low grey cliff of granite protruded from the hillside, the rock solid and ancient. This was the spot. It was hidden, it was stable, and the mountain itself would provide the building materials. He sat for an entire day, visualizing the work. It would not be a pit, it would be a tunnel. He would dig straight into the hillside horizontally for at least 10 feet. This tunnel would act as a thermal buffer, a long, cold neck protecting the main chamber. At the end, he would hollow out a room, perhaps 6 feet square and 6 feet high. The mouth of the tunnel had to be small, just big enough for him to crawl into, a defensive bottleneck. He would line the entire thing, not with wood, which rots, but with the granite he could split from the cliff face. And the door. The door was the linchpin. It had to be too big for a wolverine to move, too solid for a bear to break, and too heavy for anything but a man using leverage to open. He spent 3 days searching the scree field below the cliff. He found it, half buried in the earth, a single, massive slab of exfoliated granite, almost perfectly flat, 6 inches thick, roughly 4 feet square. It had to weigh close to 1,000 pounds. It was perfect. It was impossible. He spent another day just studying the slab, planning how to move it. He would use log rollers, a lever, and the slope of the hill itself. It would take weeks. He began his list of problems, digging through the rocky soil, splitting the granite, moving the slab, ventilating the chamber. A sealed tomb would lead to rot. He would need a small ventilation shaft, a hollowed-out log, run 60 feet up the hill, emerging from a cluster of rocks, invisible and too small for any animal. He was no longer a trapper. He was an engineer, a mason, a vault builder. That evening he built a small fire, not for warmth, but to forge the head of his pickaxe, sharpening it to a vicious point. He sharpened his shovel, and he ran his whetstone along the curved blade of his adze, the tool he would use to shape the heavy timber frame that would support the tons of earth above his new chamber. He would not be hungry this winter. The work began at dawn the next day. It was the most brutal labor of his life. Digging the tunnel was a nightmare. The hillside was a dense web of aspen roots and stone. For the first 2 feet, he used a shovel. After that, it was the pickaxe, swinging in the cramped space, jarring his shoulders, his hands blistering and breaking open. He'd strike a rock, and it would take him half a day to pry it out with his lever. He hauled the dirt out in a hide bucket, dragging it behind him as he crawled. It took him 2 weeks to cut a 10-foot tunnel, a hole just 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. When he finally had space to stand, he began to hollow out the chamber. The thud of the pickaxe against the dense, cold earth was the only sound, muffled by the hillside. He felt like a badger digging for his life. Once the chamber was hollowed, the masonry began. He quarried the granite from the cliff face using a sledgehammer and iron wedges he'd packed in. He'd find a hairline crack, hammer in the wedges, and listen for the sharp crack as a slab split away. He'd drag the pieces to the tunnel entrance. Inside, in the dim light of a tallow candle, he began to build the walls, dry stacking the stones with meticulous care, fitting them together, using smaller chips to wedge them tight. The earth walls of his tunnel kept trying to collapse, so he shored them up with timber as he went, using his adze to flatten the sides of the logs, making them fit snugly against the stone. The roof of the chamber was the most dangerous part. He needed heavy ridge poles. He felled 3 massive spruce trees, each over a foot in diameter. He cut them to length and, using the adze, hewed them flat on one side. Getting them inside the tunnel and hoisted into place was a feat of raw strength and patient leverage. He nearly crushed himself twice. On top of these main beams, he laid a deck of smaller adze-flattened poles. Then came the waterproofing, a thick 6-inch layer of puddled clay he hauled up from the creek, bucket by bucket, packing it onto the roof deck until it formed a seamless, waterproof shell. Finally, he covered the entire thing with the sod and earth he had first excavated, painstakingly transplanting the ferns and bushes back on top. When he was done, the hillside looked almost untouched, save for the dark, square mouth of the tunnel. Now, the door. It took him 4 days. He built a path of log rollers, and using his longest, strongest pole as a lever, he inched the 1,000-pound granite slab from the scree field to the tunnel. The final move was the most critical. He had to raise it upright. He built a heavy frame around the entrance, a gantry of thick timbers. Using his rope and the mechanical advantage of a simple pulley, he strained until he thought his heart would burst, and the slab slowly, grudgingly, rose upright. He had already set a massive greased wooden post into the ground to act as a pivot. He leaned the slab against it. It scraped, it grated, but it moved. It seated itself against the stone-lined mouth of the tunnel with a sound like a mountain closing. It was done. He stocked it in late September. He filled the cool, dark chamber which held a steady 40 degrees, he noted, even on a hot afternoon, with smoked venison, dried fish, sacks of flour, beans, and even a small keg of whiskey. The air inside smelled clean, earthy, and cold. He pulled the great stone door shut, the sound a deep, resonant thoom. He wedged a small carved piece of wood into the gap to lock it in place from the outside. He felt a profound sense of security he had never known in his life. The test, he knew, would come. It came in January. The mountain world was locked in a cold so deep that trees split open with sounds like rifle shots. The snow was 6 feet deep on the level, and the wind had sculpted it into drifts 30 feet high. Jedediah was secure in his cabin, but his mind was on his cache. He waited for a break in the weather, a day when the sun was a pale, useless disk in a white sky, and he snowshoed up the slope. He had to dig for 10 minutes to even find the door. The snow was piled deep, a perfect insulator. He pulled the wedge and put his shoulder to the stone. It grated open. A wave of cool, but not freezing, air flowed out. He lit a candle. Inside, everything was pristine. The smoked meat was dry and pliable. The sacks of flour were untouched. A skin of water he'd left inside was liquid, not even slushy. The frost had not come near it. The mountain had held it safe. The real test came a week later. He was checking his trap lines when he heard it, a sound of pure, concentrated rage echoing across the valley. A grizzly. He ran, his heart pounding, not to his cabin, but to a high ridge overlooking the cache. It was the old monarch, the one from the year before, bigger and more desperate in the deep snow. It had smelled his ventilation shaft. It was at the tunnel mouth, tearing at the hillside. Jedediah watched, his rifle resting on a rock, his hands steady. The bear dug at the sod roof, but the heavy timbers and clay, now frozen solid, didn't budge. It was like scratching at a boulder. Then it turned its attention to the door. It clawed at the granite, its claws screeching uselessly against the hard rock. It shoved its massive shoulder against it. The stone did not move. It bit the edges, its teeth skittering off. Finally, the bear rose to its full, terrifying height and hammered on the slab with its forepaws, a drumming, desperate assault. The stone door, seated in the earth, held fast. It was no longer a cache. It was a vault. The bear roared, a sound of frustrated fury, and for an hour it attacked the unmoving stone. At last, exhausted, it simply gave up. It slumped in the snow, breathing hard, then turned and shambled away into the timber, defeated. Jedediah Stone let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for a year. The adze, which had shaped the roof timbers, had done its job. The stone, which he had wrestled into place, had done its... He had not built a barrier, he had built a part of the mountain. The following spring, Jedediah's pack at the rendezvous was heavy with prime, thick-furred beaver pelts. The other trappers, gaunt and sallow-skinned after the long snow, looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and awe. His face was full, his eyes clear. He had not merely survived, he had thrived. "You find a secret valley. Stone?" Hobbs asked, his voice raw. "One where the game just falls down for you?" Jedediah shook his head. "No, I just kept what I hunted." He took Hobbs and 2 other senior trappers back to his valley. When they saw the cache, they were silent. They ran their hands over the cold granite slab. They pushed, marveling at the perfect, balanced pivot. When Jed opened it, and the wave of chill, clean air rolled out, they peered inside at his remaining stores untouched by frost or rot. They understood. They were looking at the end of the hungry winter. The idea spread, not like a wildfire, but like a root, slow, and strong. The stone cache, as it came to be known, began to appear on other north-facing slopes. Not all were as grand as Jedediah's. Some men, lacking a single slab, built doors of triple-layered cross-braced timbers, hardened with fire and reinforced with iron from broken traps. Others, in softer soil, lined their tunnels with thick-piled aspen walls, using the adze to fit the logs so tightly not even a mouse could find purchase. The core principles, however, remained. Dig deep into the north slope, below the frost, use the earth's mass as your insulator, and build a door that respects the desperation of a starving bear. The legacy of the design was measured in lives not lost. It was the trapper who broke his leg in a blizzard, but was able to hole up in his cabin for 6 weeks, living on the stores from his secure cache. It was the family of settlers who, following the trappers into the high valleys, adopted the design, building root cellars that were not just pits, but climate-controlled fortresses that saved their seed potatoes and cured meats, allowing them to survive their first brutal winters. The knowledge passed from Jedediah to Hobbes, from trappers to settlers, from fathers to sons. It became vernacular wisdom, a part of the unwritten language of high-altitude survival. The adze that had shaped the timbers was eventually worn down to a nub, its handle replaced 3 times, but the structures it helped build became quiet, grass-covered monuments to a new way of thinking. Looking back, the genius of Jedediah's vault was its profound understanding of thermodynamics, long before the word was known in these mountains. The standard cache, the shallow pit, was a fool's bargain. It was trapped in the active layer of the earth, the surface, which is subject to every violent swing of the seasons. It froze in winter, turning meat to iron, and baked in summer, turning it to rot. It was a storage system governed by the sky. Jedediah's vault, by contrast, was governed by the planet. By digging 10 feet into the hillside, he had bypassed the sky. He had tapped into the Earth's deep, constant thermal mass. Below the frost line, the ground maintains a steady temperature, a balance point between the sun's heat and the planet's core. His cache was a geothermal battery. The granite walls and the thick clay roof were not just for strength. They were insulation and thermal sinks. They absorbed the Earth's steady chill and repelled the brief, violent intrusions of surface heat or cold. The long, narrow tunnel was a simple, brilliant heat exchanger, ensuring that any air entering the vault would be pre-cooled or pre-warmed by the 10-foot journey through the Earth. The ventilation shaft was the final piece, creating a slow, passive chimney effect that pulled out moisture and prevented the buildup of mold and gases. He hadn't just built a box. He had created a stable, independent microclimate. Later engineers would call this passive geothermal design or earth-sheltered construction. Jedediah Stone, driven by hunger and the memory of a grizzly's claw marks, had simply called it sense. He had recognized that the mountain's greatest threats, its crushing cold, its relentless predators, were surface problems. The solution was not to build a stronger wall on the surface, but to leave the surface world behind. He had used the unchangeable laws of the mountain to defeat its own volatility. Jedediah Stone trapped that valley for another decade, his cache, his silent, faithful partner. He grew older, his hands knotted with arthritis from the cold stone and the unforgiving adze. When the beaver trade collapsed and the settlers began to fill the lower valleys, he sold his cabin and moved on, disappearing into the west, a ghost of the first wave. but his structures remained. Long after he was gone, ranchers found the man-made caves, the sod-covered mounds barely visible on the hillsides. They marveled at the heavy stone doors, still hanging on their pivots, still opening with a heavy scrape to reveal a space that felt like spring on the hottest day of summer. They used them, adapting them for their own needs, storing milk, butter, and potatoes. The cache outlived its maker, a quiet testament carved in rock. The lesson Jedediah had learned was not just about building. It was a philosophical shift. The frontier taught a hard lesson, that convenience is often a trap, and that shallow solutions lead to catastrophe. His first cache, the shallow pit, was an act of convenience. His second was an act of profound, grueling preparation. He had learned that survival is not about dominating the environment, but about understanding its deepest rhythms and finding your place within them. It is the wisdom to know what is changeable and what is constant. You cannot stop the winter. You cannot reason with the bear, but you can use the constant, steady heart of the earth to shield you from both. True security, he had discovered, is not a fence against the world, but a foundation dug deep within it. It is the humble, unseen work of building for a reality you cannot control, respecting the forces of nature enough to use their own laws as your greatest defense.